We're very pleased to have with us today Pramila Patten, the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict. And she's here to talk to you about her trip to Bangladesh, including to Dhaka and to Cox's Bazar. Ms. Patten, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this on?
I think so. Yeah, it should work fine.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming to this briefing. I did issue a press release on the 16th of November, so I will try and provide some additional information. I was in Bangladesh from the 5th to the 13th of November, and I actually spent 3 full days in Cox's Bazar, where I visited 4 different camps, Kutupalong, Uchiprang, Leda, and Konopara border area. And in advance of my visit in Cox's Bazar, I had dispatched a technical team comprising of an interagency team comprising of UNFPA, experts from UNFPA, UNICEF, and IOM, and also someone from the Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative from the foreign UK Foreign Secretary. So in terms of additional information from my press release, I just want to say that I met with many survivors and witnesses, and I was quite surprised by the openness of the women and the girls to speak to me. But I also heard directly from caseworkers and other service providers. For me, the main objective of this briefing is to really amplify the voices of the women and girls who have so bravely talked to me, because they want the world to know what they have gone through. And it is my humble way of bringing their suffering out of the shadows. It's true that they looked at me with hope, but today I can only share with you their stories of pain, their despair. So the stories of pain are widespread in the camps I visited. The pain and suffering of the Rohingya women and girls is simply unimaginable. Over 3 days, I have heard the most heartbreaking, most shocking and horrific accounts of abuses committed cold-bloodedly with unparalleled hatred against the Rohingya community. No one was spared: men, boys, women, girls, babies, and the elderly. They were butchered, literally. The forms of sexual violence we consistently heard about from survivors and witnesses included gang rape by multiple soldiers, forced public nudity and acts of humiliation, sexual slavery in military captivity. And in fact, many still bore visible scars, bruises, and bite marks attesting to their ordeal. It was clearly a case of sexual violence being used as a tool of dehumanization and as a form of punishment. Several women recounted how, upon arrival of the soldiers in their village, the women and girls were forced to strip naked and to lie down often under the scorching sun, threatened with rape and gang rape while their houses were torched, and their husbands or fathers were requested to sign a document to the effect that they had torched their houses. And they recounted how often the village leader had to take upon that responsibility of signing those documents. We met with a number of witnesses who reported rapes of the most extreme and brutal nature, which included the tying of women and girls to a rock or a tree before being gang raped by multiple soldiers, and many were literally gang raped to death. We met with too many eyewitness. We had too many eyewitness reports of girls who were raped inside their house and left to die whilst the house was torched. Many women and girls have witnessed their families being slaughtered in front of them. They have seen their homes and villages razed to the ground. And most of the women I spoke with shared with us the details of how these brutal acts of sexual violence occurred in the context of collective persecution, the burning and looting of villages, torture, mutilation, and the slaughtering of civilians, even babies, as I mentioned, who clearly represent the next generation and the future of their community. And I must mention this. One disturbing feature was accounts about the killings of babies, which started well before the 25th of August, let alone that a few women mentioned how they were being gang raped and their babies were being thrown in the fire, but they recounted how there was a pattern before the 25th of August where they could not sleep with their doors closed. Army would come, would pick a baby and drown the baby in the village well, and would contaminate. That would be a way of contaminating the water and depriving them with water. And I found this to be extremely disturbing, because it from camp to camp, we heard this. So the widespread threat and use of sexual violence was clearly a driver and push factor for the forced displacement on a massive scale, and also a calculated tool of terror aimed at the extermination and removal of the Rohingya as a group. These are my observations. All the survivors shared their ordeal of how they spent days in the jungle eating leaves and drinking muddy water before being able to cross the border. But even then, they were caught up by landmines placed along the border to prevent return. And many were shot as they fled, and I saw women with legs amputated, and many of the women and girls I met had gunshot wounds and other grave injuries. As mentioned in the press release, my observations point to a pattern of widespread atrocities, including sexual violence against Rohingya women and girls who have been systematically targeted on account of their religious and ethnicity. And a clear picture has emerged of about the alleged perpetrators of these atrocities and their modus operandi, namely that the sexual violence has been commanded, orchestrated, and condoned and perpetrated by the armed forces of Myanmar, the Tatmadaw. And other actors involved include the Myanmar Border Guard Police and militia, composed of Rakhine Buddhists and other ethnic groups. These were the questions that we asked to the women and the witnesses that we met. I would, at this point, like to take this opportunity to really extend appreciation to the government of Bangladesh for the lives they have saved, and they are continuing to save as we speak, because I did meet with new arrivals, and there were new, fresh accounts of rape. By providing refuge to this community, which many have called the most persecuted people on earth. And I have been truly very, very touched by their humanity of not only the government of Bangladesh in opening their borders, but the people in opening their homes and their hearts and to the Rohingya affected community. But I must say that in the light of the magnitude of this crisis, the government of Bangladesh and the host communities in the settlement areas are stretched to the limit of their capacity to provide the basics of shelter, food, water, and primary health care. It's important to know that while the host community deserves a lot of credit for being the first responders, we don't know to what extent this will be sustained, because they are, the host communities are falling below the poverty line. As food prices are increasing, the price of day labor is decreasing, and tourism, the main economic activity in Cox's Bazar, is also down. The camp has increased pressure on the forest, land, and water, which greatly impacts on the host communities, and this is a matter of great concern to the government of Bangladesh. In terms of concerns that I would like to, protection gaps that I have seen. I'm very concerned about the vulnerability of women and girls, but also boys, facing a heightened risk of trafficking, including for the purpose of sexual exploitation and forced prostitution, but also organ trafficking. We have heard about early and forced marriage of girls amongst the displaced community, exacerbated by lack of education, as well as significantly high number of child-headed household and unaccompanied orphan children. We know from our experience in similar settings that conflict-related trauma often manifests itself in domestic violence and abuse, and we are seeing signs of this in the camps. There is extreme congestion and a lack of privacy, which is resulting in women and girls being confined to their shelters with no opportunities to access information or support social networks. And in that context, the establishment or the planned establishment of the so-called mega camps pose a range of other challenges across all sectors. Since I have arrived, I have briefed the Secretary General on the situation through a confidential note. I have started to engage with media. I'm debriefing bilaterally members of the Council on key observations. I will participate in a special session of the Human Rights Council on the 5th of December. I'm hoping to have an opportunity to brief the Security Council. I will be present. I don't know what will be my participation on the briefing scheduled to the 12th of December following the presidential statement. Otherwise, my office, with my team of experts, we are exploring the possibility, the option of a framework of cooperation with the government of Bangladesh, which could include capacity building, focusing on documentation and preservation of evidence, but also training and capacity building of relevant authorities on the prompt identification of victims, prevention of all forms of trafficking, and provision of support and assistance to victims. My office, of course, is also looking into what should go into the next annual report of the Secretary General to the Security Council for next March, and I can say that the report will certainly include a dedicated section on Myanmar. I think I'll stop here. I will be very happy to respond to your questions.
Thanks very much. If you can all introduce yourself when you ask your question to our speaker, please. Yes, Abdul Hamid.
Thank you for the briefing. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi, and thank you for this heartbreaking report. And I have many questions, in fact, especially about the reaction of the international community and the failure of the Security Council to address this issue. There was no fact-finding mission. There was no resolutions. The only meeting, there was, I think, 2 meetings. One was just consultation in closed doors, and one was an open meeting. There was no seriousness about the reaction of what's going on, compared to what happened in Central Africa when there were about a few children were abused. Fact-finding mission were sent, resolutions were adopted. The whole Security Council went to visit the area. However, when it came to those Muslims, because they're Rohingya Muslims, the word is very calm, and it's dragging their feet. Nothing had been done. So how do you explain that?
Well, I have no explanation. I can only tell you what are my expectations and what I have done. I am having, as I said, bilateral meetings with a number of members of the Council, urging them to push for me to have the opportunity to do a briefing focusing on the sexual violence. And I am also urging members of the Council to go on a visit to Cox's Bazar. I have seen a lot of efforts from the international community in the past month in trying to engage constructively with the government of Myanmar. and I can only encourage that this be intensified and that the pressure be put on the government of Myanmar. I must say that for my part, I did request for permission to visit Myanmar to have a more balanced perspective and to engage with the government of Myanmar, but my request has been denied. I fully agree that based on my observations following my visit, I think the Security Council must use all the tools that it has available to bring the perpetrators to account. I fully endorse the statement made by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on the need for an international, impartial, credible investigation. For my part, I would really like to see an independent mechanism established, like an investigative mechanism, like the one adopted very recently for Iraq, to preserve, to gather and preserve the evidence in an effort to safeguard future accountability, international criminal accountability. I think if there is the political will, a referral to the International Criminal Court by the Security Council remains an option. We can, I think the Council can still evolve from a presidential statement to a fully fledged resolution. These are options. It's in the hands of the Security Council.
So you were not invited to address the Security Council. Would you take the initiative to go and brief the Security Council?
I have had meetings, bilateral meetings, and I have expressed my interest to brief the Council.
Rick?
Hi, thanks for the briefing. I'm Rick Gladstone from the New York Times. Have you reached out to Aung San Suu Kyi? Have you talked with her about your visit, what you saw? And if you have, did she respond, and what did she say? That was my first question. And my second question is, have you talked with, like, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court about what you saw, and whether there's some other way to, bring a case to the attention of the ICC that doesn't necessarily go through the Security Council? Thank you.
Right. I sent a letter before my visit to Cox's Bazar to Aung San Suu Kyi to explain the importance of me also visiting Myanmar, but also northern Rakhine, in the light of reports that were available at the time. But my request has been denied. I have not engaged with her since I came back, but I do intend to meet with the permanent representative of Myanmar to the United Nations, and maybe I'll take it from there. And I think that could be a good suggestion in terms of sending a note to her about my observations. I think that's a good idea. I will have a meeting with the prosecutor of the ICC, who will be in New York in December in the context of the Assembly of States. But I think it's going to be very difficult for the ICC to initiate a preliminary investigation in the absence of a referral by the Security Council. But what I intend to raise with Ms. Bensouda is really based on their new policy, because they have launched in 2014 a new policy on SGBV, to which my office has input. So I will have this discussion. I will have this discussion with her. But for me, everything is in the hands of the Council in terms of a referral of the situation. And we have precedent when it comes to referral of similar situation. And I think the last one was for Libya in 2011, and the other one was for Darfur in 2005. I mean, that's just of recollection. But I think if the political will exists, a referral remains, referral to ICC remains an option. And I think as the media, you have an important role to play in putting more pressure.
Edie?
Thank you very much. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. You talked about an ethnic dimension to the rapes and sexual abuse of Rohingya women and girls. Do you agree with the UN Human Rights Commissioner that what happened in Myanmar is a textbook case of ethnic cleansing?
Right. Based on what I have heard and seen, I can fully understand why the United Nations High Commissioner described the situation as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. And I fully endorse his appreciation. I can also see a basis for characterizing these violations as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide. But it is not my role to make that determination. But I do believe, as a lawyer by profession, that there is a prima facie case for pursuing these atrocities in an international court, especially given that the sexual violence were targeted against the women on the basis of their religion and ethnicity, as a form of collective punishment and persecution against the group as a whole. I really believe that widespread and systematic rape was used to cause serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, to shred the social fabric, to force civilians to flee the country. And all this would essentially amount to a step in the process of group destruction.
Matthew?
Sure, Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I wanted to, I'd seen where you were quoted saying that, these rapes are commanded and implemented by the Army, and I wanted to know, were you able to get any information on sort of like actual individual accountability? Like at what level within the Army do you think that these acts are being ordered? And I'm asking because in the U.S. statement today, Rex Tillerson said, that the U.S. is thinking of targeted sanctions. There's always a talk of like targeted sanctions at the military. Do you think that you could, you or your office or could somebody else actually specify somewhere up the chain of command where the orders are coming from? And separately, I wanted to know whether you think the UN system should move forward and appoint a special envoy. The Secretary General, there's some dispute about whether he has to wait for the third committee or could simply do it at this time. Do you think that such an appointment would be useful, and should the issue that you're raising be part of the mandate of such a special envoy?
I'm in favor of the appointment of a special envoy, the more so that ongoing investigation being carried out by the by the Office of the High Commissioner and the Human Rights Council, the terms of reference of these investigations are not very comprehensive when it comes to documentation and gathering of evidence. The information that I got from the women and the witnesses would indicate the orchestration, because they often they knew the people in the community, the border guards, especially those that we met from Konopara border area, who knew the border guard officials. So we got some relatively precise information. Some information that we gathered from Magis, who are the community leaders, designated community leaders, that would point more towards individual perpetrators are yet to be verified. This information is being channeled to the government of Bangladesh, border guard police, for verification, and because we need to ascertain the veracity of the information before putting it to use.
Yes.
Arturo Zampaglione with ONU Italia. Is there any way to quantify the level of sexual violence? Is it possible to have an estimate? Do you have a sense that it's in the thousands, in the tens of thousands? I mean, what's the range?
That's a very difficult question, but all I can say is that, for example, I visited hospitals, a hospital in Cox's Bazar, where I got an indication about the capacity of the hospital and the number of admissions and people in that hospital, which would be in the thousands. I had meetings with Médecins Sans Frontières and also visited the health care that they are providing and the medical structure that they have set up, which is like a mini hospital. And we are talking about hundreds of cases and admissions through Médecins Sans Frontières. And the SGBV, the UNFPA, the gender-based violence specialist, they have delivered services to 1,644 survivors of various forms of sexual and gender-based violence. I'm not talking about rape, but it's various forms of sexual and gender-based violence. My guess is that this is the tip of the iceberg, considering operational challenges and constraints, considering the taboo and the stigma around sexual violence. I must say that it was also interesting that there were a number of girls who were devastated. They were talking to me. They wanted to talk to me. They would be crying a lot. They would start relating. And then they would say, but in the end, I was not raped. I mean, like, they came in the end, and you had a feeling that they were not prepared. They were not prepared. So they would say, like, I was spared, but the others were raped. It's hard for me to give a number, but I think it was very grave, the way in which the rapes were committed, and it was systematic, and it was very brutal. And I hardly met with women and girls who talked about rape. I think it was gang rape that came out, and that was also a very disturbing feature. It was mostly about gang rapes.
Thanks. I'm Amy Lieberman with DevEx. I was hoping you could describe a bit more some of the conditions in the camps that you saw and the mechanisms right now that are being created to help women and girls both physically and emotionally kind of work through what they experienced, and also to document some of what they experienced and saw as well.
Well, I mean, I always say this to my staff. We're talking about camps accommodating something like 1.2 million, if you think of the Rohingya community who came last year and before that, in a fairly small space. So it's very congested. The topology of the site doesn't make it easy because of the topology of the land. Added to this, for example, in Kutapalong, there is a proliferation of mosque and madrasa, which is taking a lot of space. It's heavily congested and very, very crowded. But I have to pay tribute to all the humanitarian actors in terms of efforts of setting child-friendly spaces. I've visited a couple of child-friendly spaces, truly impressive initiatives by UNICEF, as well as women-friendly spaces. But there is a shortage of these spaces, due also to capacity and lack of funding, but also to physical space. And even the government of Bangladesh has expressed concern about this, the large number, and we're talking about hundreds, 400 or more in one camp of mosques that have the best, in inverted commas, spot. Agencies on the ground are overstretched, but they are doing the best in the circumstances. I was very impressed by the efforts of the Bangladeshi government in terms of getting the military and the former peacekeepers who were distributing food, for example. Every day at 1 p.m. they would distribute food to children. And I witnessed that food distribution exercise. It was orderly, in spite of the huge crowd. It was orderly. The quality of food and the quantity of food, because I was in Maiduguri in July, where I met with survivors of sexual violence from the Boko Haram, who had been released from Boko Haram, and who was saying there's not enough food, no food for the babies, no food, not enough food for them. So I was quite impressed by that. And I've seen separate lines for women. In my previous position as a expert on the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, on so many occasions we've had to send statements and press statements and on food distribution, and there I could see separate lines for the women and for the children. So that was encouraging. I think the government of Bangladesh is really to be commended for containing the situation, but for how long? That's the huge question.
Yes. It's often Buddhism is described as a peaceful religion, and Islam is often also described as a violent religion. And in Central Africa, in fact, a Christian who committed crimes against Muslims. So from your experience now, what is your intake on that? The committing crimes against humanity in the name of religion, as you have seen in Myanmar.
Listen, all I can say is that since I took up office, I have started to engage with religious leaders in preventing conflict-related sexual violence. I was in Bosnia. I met with religious leaders. In DRC, I met with religious leaders and started to engage with them. I think religious leaders have a key role to play, and I think that would be an opportunity for me to express a call to religious leaders like Desmond Tutu, who has been very outspoken, but I think they should remain engaged on this subject as a former Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and also the Dalai Lama, who has, I understand, written a letter to Aung San Suu Kyi sometimes back in September, but has a Nobel Peace Prize in the 1990s for his forward-looking solutions to conflict and resolution peace processes. I also call on all the religious leaders, including the Dalai Lama, to speak out and to take a stronger position.
Thanks very much. I'd like once more to thank our guest, Pramila Patten. Thanks very much, and then thank you all for coming.
Thank you.